Hey, PreSales Collective, it's your host, James Kaikis, and today I'm going to be joined by Pabel Martin, Senior Solutions Consultant of Global Strategic Accounts at Sprinklr. The title of today's episode is Post-Sale to Pre-Sale, and this is one that's near and dear to my heart. Many pre-sales professionals, including Pabel, have started on the post-sale side of things, whether that's in professional services, customer engagement, onboarding, and have made the transition to pre-sales. In today's episode, we're actually going to talk about what has made Pabel such a successful pre-sales engineer and talk about those roots in post-sale. So if you're one of those many professionals who started in post-sales, it's now in pre-sales, this episode will really resonate with you. And if you've never actually been in a post-sale role, you'll understand why some of the best pre-sales consultants come from post-sales. Enjoy today's episode. Pabel, how are you, sir?
Doing well, James. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. I'm glad we're on the podcast together. This has probably been a long time coming.
Yeah, same. It's going to be a fun conversation and one that I'm fairly passionate about.
I am as well. And I think for those listening, Pabel was one of the first contributors to PreSales Collective. He's written a number of awesome articles that we've hosted on the site. So looking forward to having a discussion today and having you on the podcast.
Can't wait.
I got to ask, how are you generally? How are things? I know 2020 has been an interesting year.
Yeah, it's been great. My wife and I actually just moved from the US to England right around the beginning of March, which, as folks can imagine, was a really great time to make an international move. But it's been fun. It's been good, kind of outside of work, inside of work. You know, it's different like it's been for most folks, but a lot of interesting times as we all adjust to kind of the new normal.
That sounds like a podcast episode in itself. Transitioning to a new company for work during a pandemic. What's been the toughest part?
I would say switching to a new country, you expect the culture to be different, but I think through that, in terms of what am I going to do? What am I going to eat? Can I find some soccer? Oh my gosh, I need to actually call it football now. And I don't think that I fully really gave stock to that. Business really is just done differently. It's a whole cultural expectation is different, as well as just dynamics in terms of how you work inside and outside of your organization is just different. And it's not even better or worse. It's just an entirely different feel, which has been fun, but something that's really stretched and kind of forced a growth mindset, whether or not I want one or not.
And last thing is Sprinklr just announced a massive round of funding. So that's got to be good news for you and your company.
Yeah, that was really exciting. Kind of surprised a good amount of us. So, kudos to everyone keeping it under wraps internally that did know. Really exciting times. Certainly current events in the world has impacted all of our customers in unique ways. And it's been fun to really adjust and try and help them figure it out. So it's been great.
Well, before we get into today's theme, which is post-sale to pre-sale, which I know both of us have some history here, I got to ask, without giving too much away for today's episode, how did you stumble into the world of pre-sales?
So I feel like, I'm going to follow suit from some of the other folks that have been on this podcast and been great. It was a complete accident. I'm embarrassed to say I honestly didn't know pre-sales even existed for the longest time. But, really the biggest theme is that for years in my career, I've just basically been trying to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. From the beginning, whether it was education or in my first couple jobs, I knew I loved technology. That's never changed. But I didn't necessarily want to sit behind a screen all day or even be a developer. So I've kind of really just been searching for what is the role that fits my personality, where I can have some impact, where folks feel like I have the skill set to do it, that has that nice blend of technology, business or people, conversation, that type of thing. And then also scratches kind of an outside of work itch, which is just being competitive. I love any and all sports, whether it's to watch or play. And thankfully, I found pre-sales after a decent amount of time that really has been that perfect blend.
I love to hear that. And I'm looking forward to diving into your story today too. Today's theme is post-sale to pre-sale. And I think for me, when we were talking about this topic generally, I have a lot of passion around it because no offense to anyone who's currently doing post-sale, but I used to tell my salespeople that they were selling the dream and I was onboarding the nightmare. And man, that was the reason and motivation. I was like, hey, I really might want to move to this sales thing. This sales thing seems a little bit more fun. So I'm happy to talk about my story throughout this as well. And I know that you have a lot of insight into why you made the move from post-sale generally. So let's talk a little bit about that, Pabel. Tell us a little bit more about the post-sale role that you were in previously.
So, it was the traditional kind of professional services role at a software vendor. How I got to it was interesting. So I started out actually at Ernst & Young and started off as kind of a staff augmentation consulting project. So I came on as an implementation engineer for a project for one of the financial customers that we had, and eventually got hired by that customer to come and run the program once our implementation was complete. After doing that for a few years, that same software vendor came back and then actually offered me a role as an architect in their professional services group. So I was super excited about that. It was something that was really fun, really exciting. And, I was there for years, kind of worked my way up from an individual contributor role to eventually a professional services leadership group. So it was a lot of fun.
What was your favorite part about the role?
It's funny. It's kind of a little bit back to the sports analogy before, but being on a team, being handed some sort of problem. So in our context, it was, here's a customer. They've decided to invest in this solution. They need to get it implemented. And here's essentially what they're trying to solve. And really having to figure it out with both your own teammates, the customer team, and really get to the great outcome. So the problems and the projects definitely can be hard, but I loved all the opportunity it provided, right? You get to travel, sometimes internationally. You certainly get to work with some of the brands that they've got really big problems to solve. And, you really couldn't do it on your own if you wanted to. So that was definitely my favorite.
Personally, my favorite thing about pre-sales is when the customer has that light bulb moment. And I felt like in post-sale, I had a lot of that. Like you're saying, there's a lot of this is the challenge. We've been trying to figure it out. And it's not just the software, it's the change management that goes around it as well. But once you see that light bulb and you're like, oh my gosh, my life's going to be so much easier. You get that in the pre-sale, but in the post-sale, you kind of see it become a reality. And I think for me, that was my favorite part of the job as well.
That's exactly right.
I got to ask though, what was the worst part about that job?
So this will be fun with even actually a little bit of dash of irony, right? So I think for me personally, I didn't do well from a personality perspective with that kind of consistent and never changing pressure. So I think the way I describe it, if pressure or whatever was on a scale of 0 to 100, in post-sale, I found that I just was always going to be at a 65, whether it was a long implementation timeline or, hey, there's a big number assigned to the implementation statement of work that they signed, or, there's a lot of pressure to make the date. That just never really changed because it was, some sort of bug or some sort of product enhancement required, with no time, or something just would happen from a project management perspective. Like you had mentioned, all of the things that can go into a large scale implementation, they're just kind of always there. And I think just for me personally, that was really tough. And I think ironically, I really struggled sometimes with the relationships with the sales teams. That wasn't universal, but when it was hard because I would feel like things were out of my control. Something was just handed to me. And how you described, right? Like they got to maybe build the Hollywood set, but now I was responsible to build the house. And we didn't have any lumber and we didn't have any tools. That was a challenge.
Absolutely, that's a challenge. And especially if you don't know exactly what was sold in the pre-sale side of things, sales side of the house, and expectations of the customer when they purchase are one thing, but what your product can actually do is another. I always felt that that was the hardest thing for me. For you, do you remember a customer meeting or a customer call where expectations were not set appropriately and you kind of had one of those oh no moments in front of a customer?
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think for better or worse, I don't really have the opportunity to hide what I'm thinking and or feeling. Those emotions are either on my sleeve or just exclaimed without thinking. And absolutely, I remember sitting and it's in a project kickoff and you're kind of reviewing the statement of work and you're going through what their objectives are. So it's in the first 5 minutes of that discussion. And sure enough, they say something that, might as well have been an Egyptian because it had nothing to do with anything that the product was capable of doing or even was considered on the roadmap. And, that kind of initial reaction just kind of came out. And you could just tell the meeting room got very quiet, but they also knew what was happening. And you just kind of had to stumble through okay, well, let's figure out how we get there. Why is it you want to accomplish that? Why do you think that that's possible? Try and step through it without necessarily throwing a teammate under the bus, but also, keeping your own integrity as well. So yeah, very, very stark memories of those interactions for sure.
I appreciate you sharing that. And I have a quick story too. For me, there was a situation where I was in a room full of people, a large room full of people. And I was asked about something that was on the roadmap. And I was previously had a conversation with our co-founder and our head of product was like, we need this for our European clients. And they're like, you know what? It's just not going to make it let's continue to figure it out. And I was there in front of all these people and they asked me that question and I knew what the answer was and I didn't give the straight answer. And after that, I felt like, oh man, this is the worst part about post-sale. And I went back after that meeting and was arguing for it and fighting for that product improvement. And it didn't happen. And I was like, you know what? This is on my integrity. I can't totally do this anymore. So for me, that was a catalyst. I was like, you know what? I got to get out of this post-sales role. And no offense to anyone's in post-sale, because I think it's a great role generally and has a lot of really positive things about it. But there's a lot of dependencies around the greater organization that you can't control. And that's probably one of the tough things that most people face with that.
100%.
So you've told us all the things about post-sale. Why don't you tell us about why you decided to make the move into pre-sales?
Yeah, for a little context, I actually probably made the decision about 3 years too late if I kind of go back into the time machine. But, honestly, it really had to do primarily with just a lot of great mentors around me. So I just had a lot of mentors that for a good amount of time were really challenging me, pushing me towards kind of what's that next step. So at this point, I was in a management capacity in our professional services group. And I was dabbling in some of the pre-sales efforts, right? Working through scoping exercises, being involved in final presentations as the team is trying to close deals. But, either due to previous interactions or honestly, I was really nervous about the word sales and sales engineering. I wasn't really proud of that. So just for whatever reason, I had that view in my mind that that was not for me. And it took a lot of mentors really forcing me to come to terms with the fact that, look, you're not ultimately happy in what you're doing. You seem to have a real knack for this and you come alive, you're energized in these rooms and these discussions and all of the pre-planning. You really should make that jump to pre-sales and absolutely make that happen. So it took a little bit of time. I would say surround yourself with great people that will tell you the truth, whether or not you want to hear it, and you'll usually get to the great outcomes.
Do you think it was the aspect of having sales in your title and in your role that was holding you back, or was there something else?
I think more than anything, I either thought, I don't know if this can be done well because I've had a couple bad experiences and I don't know a way around it. Or two, I'd be embarrassed about sales in my title because I'd heard the classic stereotypes, right? The more clothes you wear, the less you know. If you've got a tie, that's not the person you want to listen to, all those kinds of things. And I was showing up in button-ups and jeans. So, I just kind of felt like I was right where I needed to be and didn't really want to be the stereotypical salesperson. But what I really didn't do was just fully understand the role. I didn't actually listen to the pre-sales teammates I had. I didn't dig into their day-to-day. And it wasn't until really being pushed by some folks to really do that, to explore and to give it a chance, that I actually really started to come around.
So you said that you had mentors who pushed you. Were these mentors post-sale folks? Were they pre-sale folks? Were they both? Were they a totally different realm? Tell us a little bit about that.
So we had some sales engineering managers at the company I was at the time. We had our VP of professional services, was someone I had a good relationship with. And then we had someone that was in the pre-sale side that was involved in a lot of the scoping efforts, putting statements of work together and kind of understanding customer requirements and doing all of that. So, just across working with those individuals or people in those functions kind of globally, I built some good relationships and had some already. And those are absolutely the people both inside of pre-sales organizations and in the post-sales world as well that really just pushed and really encouraged me to just be open to it and give it a chance. And I got to tell you, I am so glad that I did, because they have genuinely changed the trajectory of my life, both personally and professionally.
That truly is amazing. It's great how you look back on a decision and you're like, why did I take so long to make it? And you think about all the ways and all the scenarios, but like you're saying, you make that decision and how much benefit it's had on your life. Generally, it's amazing to hear. So really appreciate you sharing that with us. So let's talk about that post-sale experience into the pre-sales world. What about your post-sale experience has made you become a great sales engineer?
It's looking back that you can appreciate it. So I just would really encourage everyone that, look, you're the master of your own story. You know it better than anyone else. And experiences have a real uncanny way of building upon themselves to get you right where you need to be and to enable you to be in the best possible position. But I think coming from a professional services background, first, you've got to partner with your customer to solve typically hard problems. No implementation I've ever been a part of has gone perfectly. Maybe I did them wrong the entire time, but I don't think I'm totally alone there. So, really partnering and coming up with creative solutions to hard problems, that's the entirety of what that post-sale experience can be like, and that really will serve you well in a pre-sales function. Certainly dealing with the pressure of timelines, revenue expectations, customer sat objectives, things like that, obviously would translate into the pre-sales world. They'll look certainly a little bit different, but those won't necessarily be a shock to your system. And then there's certainly the opportunity in a post-sales function. Often, you've got to make a decision in certain stages of a project, or maybe architectural decisions that you need to make. So really making the complex things simple is a big part of the job. And that absolutely translates into the pre-sales world. In some ways, that's one of the most important skills I think you can have. And then I think finally, empathy. So having lived through really good transitions from pre-sale to post, you really just get to appreciate the entirety of the customer experience. And I think understanding what it's like on the back end to build that house makes you really sensitive to that Hollywood set that you're building on the front end for sure.
I love the Hollywood set in the house example. That's good. I'm going to use that. Thank you, Pabel. I'm taking that. So I have a question then. In terms of your current role, how much overlap do you have with your post-sale team?
One of the things that I've seen in terms of the transition is, primarily with the move to SaaS, it's really shifted. And now I find myself working with post-sales counterparts almost day to day. So, initially it was implementing on-premise software and that type of thing. And the lines were a little bit more stark in terms of pre to post-sale and some of the professional services and support and kind of like those delineations. What I'm finding now in the SaaS world is that I'm consistently working with my customer success counterparts. You're working often with implementation teams as customers aren't necessarily buying, every year, every 2 years, but incrementally adding on products or adjusting their subscriptions and the types of things that they're doing. And then certainly depending on the size and scale and scope of your customers that you're working with, you're going to be working day to day with your customer success counterparts. So in my current situation, right, I'm working on a global strategic account team. So these are some of our larger customers, and these are some of the biggest brands in the world. So you've got to be in sync, in lockstep with everyone that's supporting the account from a managed services perspective and kind of ongoing management of the platform, customer success to support enablement, and then certainly any implementations of new products that they're either buying or that they're implementing in different phases.
I appreciate you breaking that down. Are there any specific ways that you partner with your post-sale team that you think are different than what some of your other pre-sales peers do, or allude to your experience working on the post-sale side of things?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I have a real extreme bias towards, there's not even meant to be handovers. We all need to just be involved from the beginning. As an example, I really look at the relationship between my account executive, myself, and then the lead customer success director at a customer account as a triumvirate, right? So you'd had a great episode with some guests around the AE and pre-sales partnership. And what I've seen is that when I consider that kind of like a 3-person weave, that really becomes when the magic happens, because, honestly, a lot of the post-sales counterparts love being involved in pre-sales, but maybe don't want to carry a quota. I certainly live that life, and 100%, that's a totally valid approach. But then conversely, I need to see, and how you had mentioned before, right, like those light bulb moments, I want to be around for those. I want to see that we're actually making an impact and helping customers get to some objectives. So staying tied into the day-to-day and the outcomes that are getting driven in a post-sale capacity is super helpful as well. So there's a lot of blend and blur between the lines of what's a pre-sale meeting versus a post-sale meeting and all of that. And I think staying in sync with those teammates is a great opportunity.
I think as a hiring manager, some of my best employees have come from an implementation or post-sale side of the house. And I think for me, it really allows us in pre-sales to have a sense of reality, because I think a lot of times we'll give the account executives a hard time for not really knowing the product or not knowing what it does. But sometimes us in pre-sales, if we're not working with the install base, we're in the same boat. And you've actually been, like you're saying, on the implementation side, you're actually building that house versus that Hollywood set. It is a very different reality. And when you have that context, I think it allows you to have, like you said, more empathy, more understanding of what you're actually selling and how it actually fits beyond just product marketing value props or marketing material. It allows us to paint that picture a little bit better.
That's a really good point. I think one piece I'd add to that is that some of the best perspective you'll ever get is from your post-sales teammates, because they will give you this credibility that you can't otherwise have. So when you're sitting in that large room during that final presentation and you want to make sure that you connect and you have empathy and you let customers know what reality is going to be able to tell them with confidence, hey, here's the good, the bad, and the ugly of implementing this product, and here's the reality of what you're going to face, just gives you a credibility that you really can't replicate and that you honestly don't get unless you're really tied in to that day-to-day reality of what implementation and ongoing management is like.
I love that. And so I'm going to put you on the hot seat with this because this is something that's top of mind to me. When it comes to customer introduction, you're introducing yourself for the first time to a customer. Do you highlight that you worked in post-sale?
Not to give the post-sale answer, but it depends, James. It depends. It typically does come down to the audience. And I don't necessarily always include it in terms of like the introduction. Hey, here's my background. But there are absolute ways that I will slip it in terms of the conversation when you're either introducing, hey, you're not always going to be stuck with me, right? You're going to get an implementation team that's going to come and really make this come to life. And you just sneak in I know what that world is like. I sat in that seat. I've been in your position. When you're able to share those kinds of anecdotes and those realities, it usually goes over pretty well.
It builds credibility and builds trust. And I have some people on my team at Salesforce that actually come from customer success. And so I do ask that they highlight that during their introduction when they first get on the phone, because it allows them to build a little bit more credibility in terms of, I understand the reality and I can work with you. Or sometimes I have people who have worked for manufacturing companies and I sell into manufacturing. And I say, hey, highlight your experience in manufacturing to help build credibility right away. So I just had to ask you that question. We have some people who are listening to this podcast that are in post-sale or on the customer success side of the house that want to make the transition to pre-sales. What advice would you give those that are listening that want to make that transition to pre-sales?
If I think through what I wish I had known when I first started off the journey, to be completely transparent, it was probably 12 months of being a pre-sales engineer before I became even remotely competent. I owe a great debt to those first SE managers that I had and the teams and the people that really invested a lot and just were patient as I figured it out. And I think the advice I would give from that experience is you really got to prepare yourself for a Jedi mind trick. If you're not in the scenario where instinctively you recognize the importance and the value of the soft skills and of selling and of attaching to business value, we all say that for sure, right? We're trained to do it and you kind of pick the terminology up. But if your brain doesn't instinctively go there first, and if it goes to technology first, you've got a little bit of a learning curve and you've got a hurdle that you're going to have to overcome, because in the post-sale world, right, it's tech first and how do we solve the problem in front of me. But often in pre-sales, I find that you get to better outcomes when you start with the business problem first and then the outcome that you're trying to get to, and then bring the technology discussion in. So I would just really encourage, and what I'm finding is that if I spend an hour on my demo preparation, I spend minimum an hour on my PowerPoint presentation and on my messaging and on my practicing and the softer quote unquote side. So look, they're great resources from a lot of the collective members. Just Effing Demo, Mastering Technical Sales from John Kerr, right? The Demo to Win programs, all of those are great. And you've got to focus on them because that's a core skill set of the role. But I think of resources like Chris White's 6 Habits, a lot of training that I've gotten from Steve Capper, right? The soft skills of how to run a meeting, how to present, how to tailor PowerPoints, how to do your messaging. That's just as, if not more important sometimes in order to truly connect and be successful with helping get to customer outcomes.
That's a mic drop answer right there. I really appreciate that. I was going to ask you a follow-up question about practicality, but you definitely covered it. Before we sign off, I have 2 last questions for you. I already asked you the advice question, but I'm going to ask you a different advice question. What is your favorite thing about the pre-sales role?
So I'm going to cheat. It's technically 2 things in my answer, but let's see if I can make a run-on sentence, make it seem like one. It's the ability to have impact. Your impact's not always great. Sometimes the impact's not what you want, but you work so hard. There's strategy, there's messaging, there's how do we demo this? How do I handle objections? How do I compete? How do I get the customer to move beyond just doing nothing? Right? There's all of this work that you do with tons of team members, both in pre-sales roles and in post-sales functions. And then you get that moment where you have to execute. It's the meeting, it's the RFP demo, it's whatever it might be. And your customer's either going to sign on or they're not. You're going to get the result and you're not. So when it works, it's like you're making music and it's great. But the converse side, you see the impact if you don't execute. And that's obviously just as hard, but it still gives you an impact to improve, to get better. Like you see the opportunity in front of you as well. So I think that immediate feedback of right after the meeting or right after that decision point is absolutely one of my favorite things. And then I think second, I feel like in pre-sales, you get as much opportunity as you're willing to take on. And at least in my experience, there's things that I just never considered possible for me to do, much less have an opportunity given. You're going to be involved with marketing. You're going to give feedback to some of the most brilliant product managers and engineers in the world. You're going to get to speak publicly if that's what you want. You can demo, you can give presentations. There's just a wealth of skill that you will build as you go on your pre-sales journey that just opens up so many more doors than you thought possible.
So I would ask you, what advice do you have for people who want to move from post-sale to pre-sale? But we covered that one. So I'm going to ask you, what advice do you have for people who might be in the US and want to transfer to Europe or APAC or vice versa with their companies? Because you just made that transition. So let's give some actionable advice of if someone's interested in that, how do they go about it?
So I would say, first, and this might seem obvious, but was really awkward for me, is make your desires known. It was kind of a personal and professional desire for me to get international experience. And I either didn't tell anyone or I just kind of would wait for an opportunity to pop up, but I never would really proactively kind of speak up. So I think first and foremost, it's just do that. And I think second is you've really got to think through what's the value first to yourself in terms of getting that international experience, but then also to your company. Because at the end of the day, like there's some practicalities involved. Depending on the region of the world you're trying to go to, there's things like visas or permission that you need from an immigration perspective. And those things aren't necessarily free and or easy. So just really, make your ambitions known, focus on delivering value and being just great at your current role, because it will really go a long way in terms of helping justify the business case to make that type of transition and showing the impact you can have. It's tough, but do the job that you ultimately want. So raise your hand if there's opportunities to help out. If travel resumes, then, sign up for those types of projects, but build relationships, get involved with deals if possible, or even just help out teammates in completely separate functions to just show that you're in it for the business, to have impact and to ultimately be a great teammate.
Pabel, I appreciate your time today. Thanks for talking about your career transition. Appreciate all the writing that you do for PreSales Collective, and thanks for being involved.
Real pleasure. So grateful for this community. Thanks for the opportunity to just have this conversation, and really looking forward to the next ones. Appreciate it.
All right, PreSales Collective, thanks for listening to today's episode. I really enjoyed hearing Pabel's experience about post-sale and the post-sale transition. To me, I feel like the pre and post-sale role is very similar. Maybe 65 to 70% of that role is very similar, but that 30 to 35% is different. I love post-sale. I think it's a great role. I think that you have to have a little bit different of a skill set, and those who really have the patience to be in that role, I commend you on that. For those that have made the transition to pre-sales, you can tell it's a very natural transition within organizations. It allows you to potentially fall on your subject matter expertise and be able to get into a company a little bit easier. When you think about what it takes to be in post-sale versus pre-sales, it's definitely a different mentality. But if you go into the world with eyes wide open and know what you're kind of getting yourself into on the sales side, it allows you to be able to excel in that role. I really like that Pabel talked about Jedi mind tricks in pre-sales as you are learning to put your sales hat on from your customer engagement experiences. My favorite thing that Pabel said today is that in the sales world, you're building the Hollywood set, and in post-sale, you're building the house. That to me really resonated. And for us that are in pre-sales, if you have a connection with your post-sale team or don't, I would absolutely encourage you to get to know them a little bit better, because understanding how they build the house will help you be better in pre-sales. All right, PreSales Collective, thanks again for listening to today's episode. As always, share our podcast. If you have any feedback for me, let me know. I'm also looking for other topics to bring onto the podcast. So if you're like, James, I really want to hear this topic, or can we talk about that? Please reach out to me on the Slack. I'll gladly roll it into our podcast release schedule. See you next week.